The European Union's carbon border adjustment mechanism places a carbon-related cost on selected carbon-intensive imports. Its objective is to prevent carbon leakage and align the carbon cost of imported goods with that faced by European producers. But for African exporters, CBAM introduces a new variable into access to the European market: the emissions embedded in what they produce. So why did Europe create this mechanism in the first place? In an earlier video, we explained how the carbon border adjustment mechanism works. You can find the link in the description if you would like a more detailed introduction. Here, let us briefly recall its underlying logic. European industrial producers have operated under the EU emissions trading system since 2005. As the European carbon price increased, policymakers feared that carbon-intensive production could relocate abroad, or that European products could be replaced by more carbon-intensive imports. CBAM was developed to address that environmental and competitive imbalance, while the free carbon allowances granted to European industries are gradually phased out. In this video, however, our question is different. What does this European mechanism mean when viewed from across a diverse African continent? What does it mean when it's perceived and seen and viewed from the lens of the African economies? There is no single African impact. African countries differ widely in their industrial structures, carbon intensity, energy systems, and dependence on the European market. The greatest immediate exposure is concentrated among countries exporting aluminium, iron and steel, cement, fertilizers, or hydrogen to Europe. The effect, therefore, depends less on being African than on what a country exports, how it produces it, and where it sells it. In other words, under today's limited scope, the continental impact is relatively modest, but that can conceal significant sectoral exposure. The African Climate Foundation and the London School of Economics conducted a study, and that study found that CBAM's initial product coverage was unlikely to impose an overwhelming economy-wide burden on most African countries. When we talk about this CBAM's initial product coverage, we're talking about these 6 products that we talked about before. So aggregate GDP figures can be misleading because the producers of aluminium, iron and steel, cement and fertilizers, those producers may experience much stronger competitive pressure, particularly where production is emissions intensive or exports are heavily concentrated towards Europe. And Mozambique is an interesting example. Mozambique's aluminium industry is a useful example because of its significant dependence on European demand. For those countries exposed to the initial coverage of CBAM, the challenge will vary at different degrees based on their progress in decarbonization. So the key point to grasp is that CBAM is not just a financial mechanism. It is also an information system. Exporters must identify, calculate, and verify the emissions embedded in their products. Producers, without reliable monitoring, without reporting, without verification systems, may have to rely on EU default values instead of their actual emissions. This creates a potential competitive disadvantage. A producer may have relatively low emissions, but still be unable to prove it. Under CBAM, the capacity to measure carbon becomes part of industrial competitiveness. And this is quite important because this administrative disadvantage could become much more consequential if CBAM expands beyond its original sectors, which we just defined, which we just acknowledged as the 6 sectors that we talked about before. And that leads us to the next point. The report of the African Foundation on Climate and the London School of Economics, the report modeled several different scenarios. Under the initial product scope, it projected limited economy-wide effects for African least developed countries. But it also examined a much more stringent hypothetical scenario in which CBAM covered essentially all imported products at a higher carbon price. And under that generalized scenario, 11 African least developed countries were projected to experience GDP to decline by approximately 1.5 to 8.4%. These figures, it's important to notice, these figures are stress test results. They are not predictions of what the present CBAM will produce. And that's important to mention. But this is an important signal that we all have to pay attention to. Because in the case of Djibouti, the study identified Djibouti as the hardest hit economy under this scenario of a generalized CBAM coverage, with an estimated decline of approximately 8%, with 91% of the modeled reduction in agriculture. But under the limited product scope, those 6 products, under this limited product scope, the report suggested that actually Djibouti did not experience this recession. The dramatic figure of minus 8% therefore illustrate what could happen if carbon border requirements spread into sectors which are central to small trade-dependent economies. That's a point we need to pay attention to. This scenario should not be presented as the expected consequence of today's CBAM, which is only limited to these 6 products, but it reflects a signal that we should pay attention to. And that leads to a much larger question, which is the following. Should every country have to pass through exactly the same regulatory lock that the European Union's CBAM is imposing as a blanket regulatory framework on all economies, regardless of their differences and diversities. So this leads us to the next question. The EU declined to create a blanket exemption for countries likely to be the most affected, partly because exemptions could create opportunities for carbon leakage or the rerouting of carbon-intensive production. Critics respond that countries with very similar historical emissions and limited technical capacity are being subjected to requirements created by a much wealthier industrial bloc. This is where CBAM intersects with the Paris Agreement. In the Paris Agreement, you had the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities. You also have unresolved questions which are related to the World Trade Organization. Is the CBAM compatible with the WTO? Is it compatible with development finance and climate justice? These are all open questions. So this leads us to the next question. African countries need more than exemptions or temporary assistance. They need credible carbon measurement systems. They need cleaner electricity, industrial decarbonization financing, and a stronger negotiating capacity. The regional trade, which is starting through the African Continental Free Trade Area, could reduce excessive dependence on individual external markets like the European Union. At the same time, carbon pricing and certification systems could help African economies retain part of the economic value that would otherwise be collected at the European border. CBAM is therefore not merely a trade cost. It is a signal about the industrial capabilities that will increasingly determine access to global markets. So the question is the following as a conclusion. Will CBAM become a barrier to African industrialization or an accelerator of a new lower carbon industrial strategy?